The rumble of the truck vibrated beneath Specialist Hart Wagner. It was a familiar sensation, little changed since he last rode one, hauling gear through the dust of Kandahar province. Years had passed, a different life had ended. This life demanded the same drab olive drab, but the faces across from him were too young, too clean-shaven, their gear pristine. They fidgeted with their packs, checked their watches, traded nervous jokes. Reservists, mostly. Some raw recruits. And him. He transferred to this National Guard unit after his regular Army enlistment ended. He needed the benefits, the structure. But the routine of the training center chafed him immediately. The formality was a performance after the brutal, practical demands of actual combat. The others sensed his difference. They knew he had been somewhere, done something. It created a polite distance, a wary respect that was isolation, not camaraderie. He was the quiet one who watched, assessed, and mostly kept his mouth shut. Weariness clung to him like the scent of old dust. The highway vanished behind them. The truck bounced along a two-lane road that twisted deeper into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The landscape outside the canvas walls shifted. Civilization, scattered houses, gas stations, convenience stores, peeled away. It was now only forest. Towering pines and skeletal hardwoods, their autumn leaves fallen, created a grim, gray-brown tapestry against the overcast sky. The cold seeped through the thick canvas. The isolation was palpable. A physical weight settled over the group. They arrived at a small, muddy clearing. Another truck was already parked there, and a few officers huddled near a folding table. Lieutenant Miro Weber, their company commander, a man whose starched uniform was slightly too big for his frame, stood apart, watching their truck pull in. The briefing was short, delivered by Weber in a flat, hurried tone that grated on Hart's nerves. It was a standard search-and-clear scenario. Locate and neutralize insurgents operating in the designated training area. Blah, blah, blah. The words were boilerplate, but Weber's eyes darted around, avoiding gazes. An undercurrent of tension charged the air, a tension that violated the nature of a routine exercise. The first real oddity manifested when Weber announced the ammunition issue. "You will receive 20 rounds each," he said, his voice clipped. Blank ammunition only. A ripple of confusion went through the soldiers. Murmurs erupted. "Blanks, sir?" a recruit asked, his voice high with disbelief. "For search and clear?" "This is a non-violent scenario," Weber said, his tone defensive. "Focus is on detection, tracking, and securing the objective, not engagement." His explanation hung in the air, thin and unconvincing. Securing an objective with blanks? Neutralizing anything? It made no tactical sense. Then came the next order. All personal blades are to be collected immediately. Standard issue bayonets will remain sheathed. We will prevent training accidents. This elicited more than murmuring. Groans and exasperated sighs filled the clearing. Knives were essential in the woods. 2 men carried serious-looking hunting knives clipped to their belts. Those were confiscated along with smaller pocket knives. Being sent into the woods, tasked with finding hidden hostiles, essentially unarmed, was profoundly stupid. It defied logic, and conditions that defied logic in a military context were dangerous. "Sir, with all due respect," Hart said, speaking for the first time. His voice was low but clear, cutting through the grumbling. Protocol was irrelevant now. We are entering deep woods. No knives, minimal ammo, and it is blanks against role players who are armed. This mission profile is illogical. Weber's jaw tightened. That is an order, specialist. Your concern is noted but unnecessary. The parameters of this exercise originate at a higher level. Higher level. The phrase was dismissive. Weber added one more peculiar note before dismissing them. You will be under constant observation. Not just from the drones. Maintain discipline. He offered no elaboration on the not just from the drones remark, staring into the trees, a muscle twitching in his cheek. As flimsy packets of blank rounds were handed out and personal blades collected by a humorless staff sergeant, Hart observed other details. Strange, bulky cases unloaded from the other truck. Equipment that was not standard field gear. The accompanying officers appeared jumpy, avoiding eye contact, their smiles fixed and too wide. They were part of something. Something complicated. Something secret. And they received only enough information to follow orders, deliberately kept in the dark about the rest. A cold knot of unease tightened in Hart's gut. It was not the familiar pre-combat jitters. This was different, dirtier. They were being led somewhere they did not want to go, by people who were not telling the truth. Anxiety was not just in the air. It settled onto them, thick and heavy as the approaching twilight. The forest swallowed them whole. One moment they were in the muddy clearing. The next, they pushed through a wall of pine needles and damp leaves. The air grew instantly colder, thick with the scent of decaying wood and wet earth. Sunlight filtered into a weak greenish-gray gloom by the dense canopy. The silence was not empty. It was heavy, waiting. Moving single file, they plunged deeper into the woods. The path, little more than a deer trail in places, vanished completely within a quarter mile. They navigated by compass and map, stumbling over roots, snagging on low branches. The simple act of movement in the dark woods was clumsy, exposed. Tension radiated off the soldiers in waves. The tight set of shoulders, the overly loud breathing, the way they flinched at every snapped twig. The detachment of command, the missing information from the briefing, gnawed at them, amplifying the unease of unfamiliar territory after dark. They set up a temporary camp just before 9 o'clock. It was standard operating procedure: find a defensible spot, establish a perimeter, dig latrines, set up tents. But execution was hesitant. The younger soldiers fumbled with tent poles in the dim light of their headlamps. The concept of a defensible perimeter was laughable with their limited means. Hart watched them, his movements efficient and practiced, a quiet observer of their inexperience. The darkness was absolute, pressing in, filled with unseen obstacles and the weight of the unknown. Patrol duty began after the camp was settled. 2-man teams walking slow, overlapping routes just outside the small circle of tents. Monotony. The rhythmic crunch of boots on leaf litter, the swing of a flashlight beam cutting brief, ephemeral tunnels into the black. It was a routine designed to build familiarity, to adapt eyes and ears to the night. But tonight the silence was too complete, the darkness too deep. It was the kind of quiet that strained listening, waiting for something. Psychologically, the unit began to fray around the edges. Whispers carried through the night air from the tents. Nervous laughter punctuated attempts at jokes. They tried to rationalize the bizarre briefing. They considered new intel, high-tech sensors they were not to disturb, or a psych test to assess stress handling. None of the theories held water. Sending them out here, practically defenseless, did not fit any training scenario Hart had experienced. It was less a test of skill and more an exposure. And then the sound started. At first, dismissal was easy. The creak of trees, rustle of leaves that could be animals. But they became distinct. A low, drawn-out scrape against bark, too smooth for claws. Footfalls that sounded bipedal, crunching deliberately, then stopping. They circled the camp, always just beyond flashlights, just at the edge of hearing. Hart, his senses honed by years of patrolling hostile territory, knew the sounds of common forest animals. These were not them. They were too intelligent, too patient. He tried the radio just before midnight. Standard issue handset. Static. He tried again, cycling through channels. More static. The emergency frequency yielded nothing. He finally reached Lieutenant Weber on the company frequency, but the signal was so broken, so choked with interference, that communication was impossible. Weber's voice was a fragmented mess of squelch and noise. Repeat. Static. Maintain. Position. Then silence. The jamming was not partial. It was absolute. They were cut off, completely isolated. They considered the possibility it was part of the exercise, testing communications under simulated conditions. But the scale of the jamming was deliberate, overwhelming. They were intentionally silenced. By the first hint of false dawn, a thin line of gray on the eastern horizon, the unit was exhausted but outwardly intact. Sleep was fitful, broken by nervous jumps and the persistent, unidentifiable sounds from the darkness. A quiet relief settled over the camp. The darkest part of the night had passed without incident. They considered it a psych-out, a brutal, pointless psych-out. But the feeling of relief was brittle. It masked a deeper, unspoken dread that grew as the gray light filtered down through the branches, revealing the silent, ancient trees that surrounded them, holding their secrets close. This calm was entirely wrong. Morning arrived cold and gray, spitting a fine, miserable drizzle that soaked uniforms and leached warmth from everything. The air smelled of wet pine and damp earth. The soldiers were a picture of exhaustion. Slumped shoulders, haunted eyes, faces pale under a layer of grime. The initial relief of surviving the night evaporated with the morning mist, replaced by a heavy, sullen tension. The routine morning head count felt sharper today, more necessary. As First Sergeant Bill Salazar went down the list calling names, responses were immediate if tired, until he called the name of one of the corporals. Silence. Salazar frowned, scanning the small knot of men huddled near the cold fire pit. "Corporal? Where is the corporal?" No answer. A few guys looked around, then towards the cluster of tents. "Maybe he is still in his tent, Top," someone offered uncertainly. "Go check, Specialist," Salazar snapped, pointing at a young soldier. The Specialist went to the tent the corporal shared with two others. He unzipped the flap, peered inside, then zipped it shut slowly. He turned back, his face etched with confusion. He is not there. His bag is empty. All his gear is here. Initial irritation at a perceived minor infraction. He had wandered off for a leak, perhaps, or was messing around, quickly escalated into something else. A cold trickle of anxiety. They had maintained a perimeter. Nobody had left the camp unnoticed. A quick search of the immediate camp area yielded nothing. Calling his name only echoed back from the silent trees. The initial confidence that he was just nearby, perhaps playing a prank or caught short, drained away, replaced by the chilling certainty that something was seriously wrong. "We need to expand the search," Hart said, stepping forward. He kept his voice calm, pragmatic. This resembled a missing man drill, but the knot in his gut knew it was not. Salazar hesitated, looking at Weber, who stood slightly apart, his face unreadable. Weber gave a curt nod. "Form search teams. 2-man teams. Stay within sight and sound. Spread out about 500 yards in all directions. Report any contact." Hart teamed up with Sergeant Becker, a quiet, competent mechanic who had also served overseas. They moved through the underbrush, calling the missing corporal's name, listening. The silence of the forest was heavier now, more deliberate. The strange sounds of the night were gone, but the quiet was wrong, as if the world held its breath. They found him about a half-mile from the camp, deep in a dense stand of old-growth pines. They found parts of him. He was high up in a tree, 30 feet off the ground, draped over a thick branch. His body was twisted into an impossible broken shape, limbs angled unnaturally. He hung there, utterly still, his face hidden from below. The air around the tree was unnaturally silent. No birds chirped. No insects buzzed. A profound, unsettling quiet permeated the small clearing around the base of the tree. Hart's stomach clenched. This was not a training accident. This was not natural. Salazar and Weber arrived a few minutes later, along with Specialist Kohler, the unit medic. Getting the body down was a grim, careful process. Once the corporal was on the ground, laid out on a poncho, the full horror of his death revealed itself. His face was contorted in a rictus of silent agony, eyes wide and unseeing. There were no signs of a struggle on the ground or on the body, no blood on the ground below where he was found. His uniform was intact, his boots still laced, his equipment pouch still clipped to his belt. It looked sickeningly as if he had been placed there. But then they saw the wounds. Deep, ragged gouges ran across his chest, down his arms, and across his face. They were not clean cuts or puncture wounds. They looked as if something had raked him with incredible force, tearing through skin and muscle. Kohler, the medic, knelt, his face pale, examining the injuries. "These are not... I do not know what these are," Kohler murmured, his voice shaky. "They are too wide for bear claws, too deep for a knife. And they look uneven. Something simply tore at him." He pointed to a particularly nasty set of marks on the bicep. There is no bruising around them. No signs he attempted to fight it off. No struggle. Placed in a tree. Impossible wounds. The pieces did not fit any known pattern. Not animal attack. Not human violence. Lieutenant Weber stood over the body, his face pale and drawn. He attempted to project calm authority, but a tremor ran through his hands. He avoided looking directly at the ruined chest. "Cause of death appears to be trauma," Weber said, his voice tight. It was a pathetic understatement. "We will secure the area and—" "Sir, with respect," Salazar cut in, his voice tight with controlled fury. "What in God's name did this? This is not a bear. This is not a role player with a rubber knife. What are we doing out here?" Weber swallowed, his gaze flickering nervously into the dense woods surrounding them. He had no answer. The look in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw revealed he knew or suspected he knew, and that knowledge terrified him. He could not explain the wounds, could not explain the lack of a struggle, could not explain why the corporal was 30 feet up a tree. His silence screamed louder than any confession. The chilling realization settled over Hart and the others who saw the body. This was not training. Something real and horrifyingly unnatural was in these woods with them, and their lieutenant knew it. The walk back to the camp was slow, heavy with the weight of the discovery. The gray drizzle intensified, mirroring the mood. The quiet dread from the morning exploded into raw fear. When the rest of the unit saw their faces, saw the grim procession carrying the body wrapped in a poncho, the camp erupted. Panic spread like wildfire. Soldiers clustered together, faces pale, voices rising in volume and pitch. What happened? What was it? Who is it? How? The questions tumbled out, desperate and accusatory. Some men stared blankly, frozen by shock. Others paced, agitated, their fear morphing into anger. "What in God's name is going on, Lieutenant?" Someone shouted at Weber, his voice cracking. "First blanks, then no knives. Now one of our own is dead in a tree?" Weber, his face still pale, tried to assert control. "Calm down. Secure the area. We must maintain order." His voice was strained, his commands rote and ineffective against the tide of terror. "This is a developing situation. We follow protocol." "Protocol?" Another soldier scoffed, his voice thick with disgust. "Protocol resulted in one of our men killed." Amidst the chaos, Hart and Salazar made their way to the radio equipment. Hart grabbed the handset. "Command, this is Unit 7. We have an emergency. 1 casualty. Request immediate extraction. Repeat immediate extraction." Only static answered. Thick, deafening static that mocked their desperation. Hart tried again and again, cycling through frequencies, shouting into the dead air. Nothing. The jamming was absolute. Their lifeline was severed. The feeling of being abandoned intensified tenfold. They were not just cut off, they were silenced. "It is useless," Salazar said, his voice low, defeat heavy in it. "They are blocking everything." "Why?" Hart muttered, more to himself than Salazar. "Why cut us off completely?" "They do not want us to call for help," Salazar replied, his eyes dark with suspicion. The idea hung in the air, cold and sharp as splintered bone. They were trapped. It was deliberate. The panic ratcheted up another notch. Hart pulled Becker and Kohler aside, away from the shouting match between Weber and the increasingly mutinous soldiers. Kohler described the wounds again. "You have seen a lot of trauma." Kohler rubbed his face with a trembling hand. "Specialist, I have seen blast injuries, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, animal attacks. I have seen bodies after vehicle rollovers. Nothing resembled this. The depth, the tearing, and the lack of surrounding damage. It does not fit." Something ripped through his clothes and skin with incredible force, but did not break bones or leave massive bruising. And the way they were distributed, they were made intentionally, not just random swipes. Becker nodded, his usual stoic expression replaced by a haunted look. "I saw a bear mauling once. It was messy. Claws tear, yes, but they also crush, leave puncture marks. This was different. And no struggle," Hart added, the detail gnawing at him. "A bear, a wolf, even a crazed human. A victim would fight. There would be torn clothes, defensive wounds, signs of a desperate struggle for life. Nothing on the corporal's body suggested he had fought at all. The rational theories crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Animal? Impossible. Human attacker? Unlikely given the wounds and placement. What else remained? The unspoken question hung between them. The unit dynamic shattered. The veneer of military discipline peeled away, revealing raw animal fear. Men who had shared tents and laughed together now eyed each other with suspicion. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves outside the immediate vicinity of the camp sent jolts of fear through them. They jumped at shadows. They challenged anyone who moved too quickly or too quietly. They attempted to reinforce the camp, dragging fallen logs into weak barriers, piling stones, futile gestures. What defense were logs against something that killed a man without a sound and left those kinds of marks? They had blanks, useless pieces of plastic and powder. The fear of the coming night was a physical entity, settling over the camp like a shroud. Second night. They had lost one already. What would the darkness bring now that the unknown had shown its horrifying face? Sleep was impossible. Most huddled together, whispering, listening. The silence beyond the camp was a held breath, waiting for the return of the sounds that had stalked them the night before. The air was thick with dread, anticipation, and the chilling certainty that they were utterly alone. The second night descended, not with the soft fade of twilight, but like a lid slamming down. The thin gray light vanished, replaced by absolute impenetrable blackness. The cold bit harder, seeping into joints and chilling bone. Tension in the camp was a vibrating wire, stretched taut, threatening to snap. Soldiers sat huddled in their tents, or near the dying embers of a small, carefully contained fire, faces pale and drawn, eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond the tiny pool of light. The silence was gone. It was replaced by a symphony of subtle, menacing sounds from the forest. Distinct rustles sounded in the underbrush. The snap of twigs was too heavy to be squirrels. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate crunching footsteps circled the perimeter, sometimes fading, sometimes drawing closer, then stopping abruptly. The walker knew they were being heard and savored the effect. A collective, silent understanding settled over the camp. They were watched. Hundreds of unseen eyes observed from the blackness. Shadows shifted at the edge of vision, just outside the reach of headlamp beams. A flicker of movement appeared, a denser patch of blackness, gone the instant a soldier turned to look. It was not imagination. It was a palpable presence. A predator stalking its prey, asserting its presence. The most terrifying moments arrived inside the tents. The flimsy nylon walls offered no real protection. Inside his tent, Hart experienced a sudden, inexplicable draft of cold air that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He looked around, but the tent flaps were secured. He reached for his pack, and his hand brushed against something that had not been there a second ago. A canteen that had moved a few inches. He froze, listening, but heard only the ragged breathing of the soldiers sleeping, or pretending to sleep around him. He saw nothing, found no sign of entry, yet the absolute certainty that something had been inside the tent with him, standing over him, left him shaking. Other soldiers described identical experiences. Waking up feeling a presence, seeing a faint shadow, feeling a cold touch on their skin, finding gear slightly moved. It was psychological torture, designed to shatter their nerves. The behavior of the forest animals added another layer of horror. Deer and elk, normally cautious but accustomed to human presence, were absent. Early that morning, they had seen a herd of deer burst from the woods in a blind, panicked stampede, risking open ground rather than staying under cover. Raccoons, normally bold scavengers around a military camp, were nowhere to be seen. The birds, which should have been chirping and rustling in the branches during the day, were silent. The entire forest held its breath, utterly terrified of something only they could not fully see. Sleep, when it arrived, was haunted. Private Clayton, a lanky kid from Detroit, woke up screaming from his nightmare. The sound. He gasped, eyes wide and unfocused. That scraping sound, grinding teeth on bone. The description, raw and visceral, sent shivers through everyone who heard it. Discipline crumbled almost completely. Orders from Lieutenant Weber met open defiance or were ignored outright. Men huddled in fear, talking in low, terrified whispers or arguing amongst themselves. We must leave this place. They sent us here to die. It is the lieutenant. He knows something. Weber himself appeared detached, moving through the camp like a sleepwalker, repeating commands without conviction, his face blank with either shock or something colder. He lost control, and everyone knew it. Chaos crept in, thick and suffocating as the Michigan fog. Every man thought only of himself, of his own survival. The second night pressed in, ensuring that survival would not come easy. The night reached its blackest point around 3 o'clock. The sounds from the forest perimeter were no longer subtle. They were bolder, closer. A low, guttural growl that was not quite animal. A rapid, tearing, scratching sound against bark that made everyone's teeth clench. A heavy, wet breathing, closer than it had any right to be. These were hunting sounds. Deliberate, terrifying hunting sounds. Flickering headlamp beams cut nervously through the darkness, attempting to catch the source. Sometimes, for a fraction of a second, a soldier almost saw something. A hulking shape, a flash of pale skin, the glint of eyes reflecting light, before it vanished, melting back into the deeper shadows. It was the constant, agonizing, almost sight that shredded nerves. Fleeting silhouettes, gone before focus was possible. The tension finally broke one of the men. A sudden, sharp cry of pure terror erupted from the edge of the camp, followed by the frantic, pointless crack, crack, crack of blank rounds being fired into the darkness. Another soldier joined in, then another. A chaotic, desperate fusillade of useless noise that advertised only their panic. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Weber yelled, but his voice was lost in the noise and the rising tide of fear. His authority vanished. The men fired blanks into the night. A pathetic, useless defense, but it was an action. In the brief, relative quiet that followed the panicked shooting, another sound cut through the air. A blood-curdling scream from one of the tents just beyond Hart's. It was sharp, high-pitched, full of unimaginable terror. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was cut off, replaced by a chilling, utter silence from that direction. No one needed to be told. Something had gotten in. Morning found them huddled, pale and shaking around the small fire. No one had slept. The screaming tent was silent, ominous. It took several minutes and a desperate act of will from Salazar to get 2 men to approach it. Hart went with them. They unzipped the flap. The air inside was thick with the metallic tang of blood. Private Clayton was in his sleeping bag. What remained of him? His body was still inside the bag, but his head was twisted at an unnatural angle, and his neck was a ruin of torn flesh and bone. The same horrible, ragged, tearing wounds that had marked the corporal covered his throat and jaw. Blood soaked the sleeping bag and the ground beneath him. But one detail broke something deep inside Hart. Clayton's sleeping bag was zipped up, fully closed, all the way to the top. From the inside. How? How could something get inside a zipped sleeping bag in a closed tent, tear a man's throat out and leave the bag zipped from the inside? It defied physics. It defied logic. It defied everything they knew about predators, about humans. This was not just brutal. It was impossible. It was the final, undeniable proof they were dealing with something utterly unnatural, something that did not play by the rules of their world. The last vestiges of military order dissolved. Screaming erupted, uncontrolled, raw with terror and grief. Men openly wept. Others cursed, spitting venom at the unseen enemy, at Weber, at the world. They scrabbled for anything that served as a weapon. Rocks, heavy branches, the few knives they had hidden or that had not been collected. A desperate, futile arming against a threat they could not comprehend, with tools they knew would not matter. Hopelessness washed over them, sharp and bitter, mixed with a burning, impotent rage. They were hunted, trapped, and systematically slaughtered by an impossible entity. And the people who sent them here had done it deliberately. Perhaps 8 or 9 soldiers remained. Huddled together, exhausted and terrified, they faced Lieutenant Weber. The air crackled with mutiny. "That is enough, sir." Private Fisher, a usually meek soldier, screamed, his face streaked with tears and dirt. "2 dead? What more evidence do you require? Call for an extraction, now." Others echoed him, their voices raw with desperation. "We are dying out here. This is not training. You are killing us." Weber stood rigid, his jaw set, his eyes hollow. "I understand your fear," he said, his voice strained but firm. "But the mission is ongoing. We have orders." "Orders?" Hart stepped forward, his own voice dangerously quiet. A cold, hard clarity settled over him, replacing the panic. He had seen men die before, witnessed impossible things under fire. This was different, worse. It was calculated. "Your orders resulted in 2 men killed, sir. Look at them." He gestured towards the poncho-wrapped body of Private Clayton. "What creature inflicted those wounds, sir? What mission justifies this?" Weber flinched but held his ground. "Higher command is aware of the situation. We have a vital role to play. You will maintain your positions." "You will follow my orders." He sounded like a broken record, repeating programmed phrases. In that moment, Hart knew with absolute certainty that Weber was not merely clueless or incompetent. He was compromised. He was either a true believer in whatever horrifying plan was unfolding, or a puppet, too terrified or too conditioned to break ranks. Either way, he would not save them. The unit fractured. A small group, 3 soldiers, stayed near Weber, fear and ingrained obedience paralyzing them. The rest, the majority, gravitated towards Hart. He had not sought leadership, but his combat experience, his calm demeanor in the face of the impossible, had made him the default leader of the survivors. The air between the 2 groups was thick with mistrust and fear. There would be no unified front. Getting answers from Weber was a dead end. He offered only platitudes and impossible orders. Hart's mind raced, sorting through the fragmented information. Weber's strange comment at the briefing. Not just from the drones, the odd, non-standard equipment unloaded from the other truck. The absolute radio jamming. They were watched, monitored, and they were silenced. Why watch them? What were they watching for? The chilling thought solidified. They were not the target of the observation. They were the bait. They were observed to see how something else reacted to them. "We must find where they are watching from," Hart said to Salazar and Becker, keeping his voice low. Weber said, "Not just from the drones. That implies ground observation. They did not simply drop us off and leave. Someone is out here. Someone who knows. Someone who is watching." He thought back to the briefing clearing, the trees surrounding it. They needed a good vantage point. Elevated. Concealed. He scanned the massive pines around the camp, his eyes moving slowly, methodically, searching for anything that looked out of place. He used the skills honed searching Afghan ridge lines for hidden enemy positions, looking for straight lines where there should be none, slight shifts in color, unnatural shapes hidden by branches. High up on an ancient pine, 60 feet off the ground, he saw it. A small, dark shape nestled among the branches, partially obscured by clumps of needles. It was too regular to be a squirrel's nest or a knot in the wood. It was a camera. A surveillance camera, expertly camouflaged but visible if you knew what to look for. There, Hart said, pointing. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, controlled fury. They were here. Watching. He had to ascend the tree. He had to see what that camera was looking at. It was a dangerous climb, the bark slick with rain, the branches high. But the need for answers, the desperate need to understand the trap they were in, propelled him. He began the long, slow ascent, testing each branch before putting his weight on it, the rough bark scraping his hands. Higher and higher he went, the camp shrinking below him, the forest canopy spreading out like a vast gray-green ocean. Finally, he reached the thick branch supporting the camera. He braced himself against the trunk and carefully reached out. The camera was small, heavy, mounted on a swivel. It was pointed away from the camp, angled slightly down, looking into the deeper, darker woods. The cold realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. They were not the subjects. They were the lure. The camera was not watching them. It was watching what came towards them from the forest. Hart's hands trembled slightly as he rappelled back down the old pine, the damp rope biting into his gloves. He landed lightly and quickly rejoined Salazar and Becker, who had waited anxiously at the base of the tree. The rest of the survivors watched him, their eyes full of desperate questions. "They are watching," Hart said, his voice flat. "From up there." He pointed towards the camera, now invisible from the ground. "But they are not watching us." The camera points out, into the woods. "They are watching what comes to us." The implication hung in the air, heavy and sickening. They were not under surveillance to test their skills. They were a variable in some horrifying equation. The thing that killed the corporal and Private Clayton, it was not just hunting them randomly. It was drawn to them. And someone observed the process. "They used us as bait," Becker whispered, his face ashen. Salazar swore, a low, vicious sound. "The goddamn brass. The goddamn lieutenant. They knew. They sent us out here knowing this thing was out there, knowing it would come for us." The sense of betrayal was absolute. A physical ache. Their own radios were useless, jammed completely. But Weber still held his company radio. It was their only chance to reach the outside world, to report what happened, to beg for rescue. Hart had to get to it. He walked back to the center of the camp, where Weber stood near the small group of soldiers still clinging to his authority. "Lieutenant," Hart said, his voice firm, "we found a surveillance camera in the tree line. It points away from the camp. We are bait. My radio is jammed. I require yours. I must contact command, report our situation, and request immediate extraction." Weber straightened, his posture defensive. "Specialist, you will stand down. That equipment is classified. You are not authorized." "Authorized?" Hart took a step closer, His gaze locked on Weber. The other soldiers watched, silent. The weight of the dead was with Hart. 2 dead, sir. Something killed them inside this camp, inside their tents, with impossible wounds. We found a camera watching it happen. You knew something was out here. You sent us with blanks and no knives. You cut off our radio. You allowed them to die. His voice rose, cracking with the force of his suppressed fury. Will you allow the rest of us to die too? Give me the damn radio, Lieutenant. Weber hesitated. He looked at Hart, at the grim faces of the other survivors, at the small, shrinking circle of men still standing with him, their loyalty wavering under the brutal glare of reality. The sheer, undeniable truth of Hart's words, backed by the presence of the dead and the chilling discovery of the camera, carried more weight than any military rank. Weber's resistance crumpled. He swallowed hard, reaching a shaking hand towards the radio clipped to his belt. All right, specialist, do what you must. Hart took the radio. It was a standard military handset, perhaps with a bit more power or access to different frequencies. He switched it on. The familiar hum, a welcome sound after the silence. He scanned frequencies, hoping to find anything. An open channel, a burst of transmission they had not heard before. He tuned past static, past the squelch of empty airwaves. Then a signal. Weak, overlaid with a low hum, but clearly voices. Cold, professional voices, speaking in clipped technical terms. The signal was likely unscrambled or only lightly encrypted, clearly deemed unnecessary for communication thought to be beyond anyone's reception. He held the radio to his ear, straining to hear over the interference. He adjusted the dial slightly, attempting to clear the signal. Then he heard it. A fragment. Just a few sentences, but each word a hammer blow to the gut. Object active. Behavioral pattern stable. 3 killed. Substrate accepted. Observation continues. Maintain containment parameters. Hart froze. The radio pressed to his ear. He heard the words again in his mind. Object active. The thing in the woods. Behavioral pattern stable. It acted as expected. 3 killed. The corporal, Private Clayton, and 1 other. Someone else had died that he did not know about. Substrate accepted. Substrate. Food. Bait. It meant the bodies. His dead comrades were substrate. Accepted. Observation continues. They watched. They monitored. Maintain containment parameters. Keep the object in the box. Keep the bait in the box. This was not training. It was not an accident. It was a controlled experiment. They were livestock, put out for something to feed on while their handlers watched from the trees, charting the behavior of their object. The cold, sterile language, the clinical detachment of the voices, was more horrifying than any scream. It confirmed their worst fears. They had been deliberately sacrificed, betrayed by their own command, used as bloody, living bait in a program they did not even know existed. The realization struck him like a physical blow, leaving him breathless and shaking with a rage so cold it felt like grief. The intercepted message stripped away the last layers of doubt, leaving only the raw, ugly truth. Substrate accepted. The corporal and Private Clayton. Their dead comrades were not casualties of a botched exercise. They were calories consumed, data points gathered. They were food. The chilling professional tone of the voices, the clinical term object, solidified it. This was not a mistake. It was a program. They had been led into a carefully constructed trap, and the system they had sworn to serve was the one holding the cage. The decision crystallized in Hart's mind. and in the minds of the survivors who had heard the message or seen the look on his face as he listened. No extraction came for them. Waiting meant becoming the next substrate. They had to break out. Now. But how? The standard routes out of the training area were monitored, blocked by the personnel running this ghastly program. They could not simply walk back the way they came. They required an alternative, an unpredictable path. Hart pulled out the flimsy map they had been given. It was useless for detailed navigation, marked vaguely with training boundaries and features. But as he studied it, his finger tracing the rough contours and printed text, he saw a small, faint symbol tucked away in a remote section, far from any marked trails. A symbol indicating a structure, and next to it, a faded annotation. Ranger cabin, abandoned. An abandoned cabin, somewhere deep in the woods. It sparked an idea. It might not be truly abandoned, or it might have been used long ago and still held something useful. An old radio, perhaps? One that operated on a different frequency? Old maps with more detail? Shelter, at the very least. It was not a guaranteed solution, but it was a concrete destination, a vector out of this death trap that was not the obvious monitored path. The cabin became their new objective. Hart quickly outlined a plan to the 7 remaining soldiers who were with him. "We are going for the ranger cabin. It is marked here." He showed them the map. "It is deep in the woods, away from the main training area. It might contain a radio, something we can use." The plan was simple, born of desperation and their dire situation. They could not engage the object. They had blanks. They could not fight the observers directly, not knowing where they were or how many there were. They needed to move fast, quietly, and unpredictably. But how to get out of the camp without being immediately pursued by the object they knew was drawn to them and intercepted by the observers who watched the perimeter? "We need a distraction," Salazar said, echoing Hart's thought. "Something big. Something that pulls their attention away." The dense, dry underbrush from the early autumn, now damp from the drizzle but still capable of burning, gave Hart an idea. "Fire," he said. "We will set a fire. Not here in the camp, but away from us. A controlled burn if we can manage it. It creates smoke. It draws attention. It will pull the object towards it or force the observers to move. It gives us a window." It was risky. Setting a fire in a forest was not something soldiers did lightly. But the stakes were life and death. "Okay," Hart said, looking at the determined, terrified faces around him. "Salazar, Becker, Kohler, you are with me. We require the medic. The rest of you." He looked towards the small group still near Weber, who watched them with a mixture of fear and disapproval. "We are going. Anyone who wants to come, now is your chance." The 3 soldiers with Weber hesitated, glancing from their lieutenant to Hart's group. One of them, a private named Schmidt, made a decision, taking a step towards Hart. Weber snapped. "Private. Stay where you are? That is a direct order." His face was contorted with a sudden, desperate fury. "You abandon your post. It is desertion. Do you hear me?" "Desertion." Schmidt froze, torn. The terror of staying warred with the ingrained fear of court-martial, of disobeying a direct command from an officer. "He is going to leave you here," Hart said, his voice low, cutting through Weber's shouting. "He knows what this is. He is part of it. He is choosing the program over your lives." Weber lunged forward, grabbing Schmidt's arm. I said stay. Becker and Salazar reacted instantly, stepping between Weber and Schmidt. There was a brief, tense scuffle. Weber, despite his rank, was no match for two angry, desperate soldiers. They did not hurt him badly, just knocked him down, disarmed him of a small sidearm he had not mentioned, and left him struggling on the muddy ground. Schmidt, pale and shaken, backed away from Weber, looking at Hart. Another soldier from Weber's group, Specialist Decker Breck, also stepped hesitantly towards Hart's side. The third remained rooted, staring in horror at the scene. "All right," Hart said, his gaze sweeping over his small, defiant group. 5 of them now. Salazar, Becker, Kohler, Schmidt, Breck. 5 of us. We move tonight. Prepare. Minimal gear. Water, compass, map. Anything else is a luxury. They quickly gathered their essential gear. As darkness began to gather, they prepared to slip out of the death trap that had been their camp. Behind them, Lieutenant Weber, defeated and abandoned, sat muttering near the poncho-covered body of Private Clayton. Their path lay forward, into the unknown depths of the forest, towards the faint promise of an abandoned cabin. Under the shroud of the second night, colder and wetter than the first, Hart Wagner's group of 5 slipped out of the camp. They moved like phantoms, melting into the surrounding blackness. Fear was a tangible 6th member of their party, but it was tempered by a fierce, burning resolve. They were no longer waiting to die. They were fighting to live. Their compasses guided them, but the dense woods fought them every step of the way. They navigated by the faint lines on the old map, pushing through tangled underbrush, stepping over fallen logs slick with moss. The ground was uneven, often dropping unexpectedly into shallow gullies or rising steeply onto rocky outcrops. They avoided the easier open clearings, sticking to the thickest cover, moving cautiously, listening to the sounds of the forest. And the forest was a living, hostile entity. It was no longer just silent or full of menacing sounds. It felt aware. Every snapping branch behind them, every rustle in the leaves to the side, every distant hoot or cry was pregnant with hidden meaning, a sign of pursuit or observation. The trees themselves watched them, their gnarled branches like grasping fingers, their shadows like lurking shapes. As they moved deeper, they saw signs of the object's passage. High on the trunks of large pines, 10 or 15 feet up, were the same deep, ragged scratches that had marked the corporal. Impossible heights for a bear or wolf. They found the remains of a deer ripped apart, the flesh bearing the same telltale wounds. Further on, near a small, muddy creek bed, they saw massive, indistinct tracks pressed into the soft earth, too large for any local animal. These findings were not just terrifying. They were confirmation. The thing was real. It was powerful, and it moved through these woods with terrifying ease. The dangers of their journey were manifold. The physical exertion was immense, pushing their tired bodies to their limits. The constant cold and damp leached their energy. Getting lost was a constant threat without GPS. Relying on an old map and compass in the trackless woods was perilous. But the greatest threats were unseen. The object itself, somewhere in the darkness around them. And the observers, the architects of the program who watched their escape attempt, waiting to intercept them. Traps were laid out here. They were being herded towards something worse. Psychological tension stretched their frayed nerves. Fear would ebb, replaced by a grim determination, only to surge back with a sudden noise or a glimpse of a shadow. They spoke little, conserving energy and minimizing sound, But when they did, it was to reassure each other, a quiet word, a shared glance. Hart felt the weight of their dependence, the need to project a calm confidence he did not entirely feel. He pushed aside his own terror, focusing on the map, the compass, the next step. He had to keep them moving. He had to believe there was something at the end of this journey other than another dead end. Hours crawled by. The forest seemed endless, the cabin a distant mythical destination. Doubt crept in. The cabin might not be real. It might not be truly abandoned. It could be just another part of the trap. Then, just as dawn was a faint promise in the eastern sky, they saw it. Nestled in a small, overgrown clearing, half hidden by trees and brush, was a small, dilapidated wooden structure. It was old, weather-beaten, sagging. It had been there for decades, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The ranger cabin. It appeared utterly abandoned. But the events of the past 2 days had taught Hart that appearances meant nothing. What secrets did this forgotten place hold? Was it a refuge or just another stage in the program's deadly game? They approached cautiously, weapons, their few salvaged knives and sharpened sticks, held ready. The silence around the cabin felt different from the silence of the woods. It felt expectant. They approached the cabin with extreme caution, circling the perimeter first, searching for any signs of recent activity, tripwires or hidden cameras. The old structure was undisturbed, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging. It appeared genuinely abandoned, weathered by years of neglect. Still, the events of the past 48 hours had taught them to trust nothing. Hart kicked the front door gently. It groaned on rusty hinges but held fast. They moved to a window and easily pried away a rotten board. Becker, being the smallest, slipped inside first, his makeshift weapon held ready. A moment later he gave a low whistle. Clear, he called softly. One by one they climbed through the window, landing on a floor thick with dust and littered with fallen leaves. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of mold and decay. Cobwebs hung like macabre decorations. The single room was sparsely furnished with broken-down furniture, a table, a few chairs, a rusted wood-burning stove. It had been empty for years. They began a systematic search, hoping for something useful. Canned food, a first aid kit, tools, an old hunting rifle. They found only mice nests, broken crockery, and more dust. Disappointment set in. Had they risked everything for an empty shell? Kohler, searching near the back wall, stopped. "Hey guys, look at this." He pointed to a section of the floor near a rough-hewn wall. Under the thick layer of dust, there was a small, clean rectangle, as if something had recently been sitting there. They brushed the dust away completely, revealing faint scrape marks on the floorboards. Someone had moved something heavy here. Recently. Their energy surged. They searched the wall above the clean spot, tapping, listening. High up, almost invisible where the wall met the ceiling timbers, Hart found it, a cleverly disguised panel, blending perfectly with the rough wood. It was not locked, just fitted snugly. He worked his fingers into a crack and pulled. The panel swung inward, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Inside was not what they expected. It was sleek, modern electronic equipment. A communication panel, a small monitor, a radio transceiver unit. It was not old Ranger gear. It was clearly military, and it was well maintained, despite the dust over the floor where something had been placed to conceal it. Beside the equipment, shoved carelessly into the cavity, were several folders and loose papers. They had been hastily thrown in, forgotten, or deemed unimportant in a quick departure. Hart reached in and pulled out the folders, handing them to Salazar. They were official reports. Salazar opened the first folder, his brow furrowed. What the? He held up a photograph. It showed a mangled body, barely recognizable as human, lying in a forest clearing. The wounds were horrifyingly familiar, the same ragged, tearing marks that had killed the corporal and Private Clayton. The photo was dated 10 years ago. They opened another folder. It contained reports detailing missing persons, not soldiers this time, civilians, Forest Service workers, fish and wildlife officers listed as presumed deceased or disappeared. Some dated back 15 years. The locations listed were all within this vast forest. Then a list. Typed, a list of military units, unit designations, dates deployed to this area. Nearly every unit on the list was annotated with terms like training losses, operational mishap, lost in action, personnel unaccounted for. One unit's entry simply read, "Mission conclusion, failed." Hart's hand shook as he picked up some loose papers. Fragmented reports, memos, internal communications, jargon-filled clinical, monitoring object beta, behavioral assessment, feeding efficacy, response to substrate deployment, containment perimeter adjustment, experimental hormonal triggers. It clicked into place with brutal, sickening clarity. This was not just a monster in the woods. It was not a random incident. It was an ongoing operation. The object was not a natural creature. It was the result of an experiment, tied to those experimental hormones. It lived in this forest, and the program, whatever military or government entity was behind it, managed it, observed it, contained it, and substrate? That was them, the soldiers, sent into the woods, year after year, unit after unit, under the guise of training. They were intentionally deployed into the object's territory. They were the feeding efficacy. They were the substrate deployment. The program did not try to hunt the creature. They managed it, using soldiers as live bait to control its behavior, to keep it within a specific area, to prevent it from breaking containment and threatening populated areas. They were not soldiers on a mission. They were disposable provisions. They looked at the photos, at the list of lost units, at the cold, clinical language of the reports, and the horror of their situation deepened beyond imagination. They were not just victims of chance. They were deliberate, calculated sacrifices in a long-running, monstrous experiment. Amidst the horrifying documents, they found something else. A detailed, hand-drawn map of the area, marked with old, faded lines. It showed something the flimsy training map did not: an old, overgrown firebreak trail cutting through the forest. And further along that trail, a symbol indicating another structure, an abandoned seismograph station, and next to the symbol a handwritten note, "Retransmitter?" A seismograph station with a retransmitter. A piece of equipment designed to pick up faint signals from deep underground and capable of broadcasting a signal powerful enough to punch through the jamming that had silenced them. Their objective shifted. The cabin had given them the terrifying truth and a potential way out. The seismograph station was their new, desperate goal. Armed with the chilling truth and the faded map from the cabin, Hart Wagner and the remaining 4 soldiers moved with renewed purpose. The seismograph station was a concrete target, a slim chance at escape. The plan was desperate, relying on speed, surprise, and the information they had found. They had to reach the station, and they had to do it without being intercepted by the program's observers or caught by the object they now knew was deliberately drawn to human prey. Their only hope was to create a diversion. "The fire break," Hart said, pointing at the map. "It is likely still overgrown, but it gives us a path, and the station is here." He traced a finger along the faded line. "We must move fast along the fire break, but we must pull attention away from it." He looked at the others, Salazar, Becker, Kohler, and Breck. All pale, exhausted, but their eyes held a spark of fierce determination. "The fire," Salazar said, understanding dawning. "We set the fire away from the fire break, north of here. As big as we can make it, fast." It was the riskiest part of the plan. But a large, fast-growing fire created smoke visible for miles, undeniable proof of a major incident. It forced the observers to react. And the object was indeed drawn to activity or disruption. It pulled its attention as well. There were 5 of them. 4 needed to make the break for the station. 1 had to set the fire. And 1 had to stay behind, for a little while at least, to ensure it caught, to draw attention, to buy the others time. It was a sacrifice. The understanding passed between them without a word. Decker Breck, the young specialist who had joined them from Weber's group, stepped forward. His face was grim, but his gaze was steady. "I will do it," he said, his voice quiet. "I will set the fire. I will make sure it gets going. Give you guys a head start." No one argued. There was no time for debate, for emotion. This was the brutal math of survival. 4 made it if 1 stayed. 5 all died if they did not create the diversion. It was a silent, agonizing moment of acceptance. "Okay, Breck," Hart said, his voice thick. He met the young man's eyes. "You know the plan. Set it fast. Get low. Stay quiet. Head south after it is burning. Try and link up with us." It was a lie, and they all knew it. Breck did not make it out. They gave Breck their lighter and what little flammable material they could find. They clasped hands, a silent farewell. Then, as the last vestiges of night clung to the trees, 4 figures broke cover, running towards the barely discernible line of the old fire break. Breck ran in the opposite direction, towards the dense woods north of the cabin. The sprint to the fire break was brutal. They stumbled through underbrush, their lungs burning, their legs aching. Every snap of a twig behind them sounded like pursuit. They felt the cold, unseen eyes on them, the presence of the object somewhere nearby, drawn by their movement, by the scent of their fear. They ran blindly, fueled by adrenaline and the burning image of the documents from the cabin. They reached the fire break, a wide, overgrown swath cut years ago, now filled with saplings and thick brush. It was not a clear path, but it was better than the trackless woods. They ran down its length, pushing aside branches, their pace slightly faster now that they had a clearer route. Behind them they saw it, a plume of thick black smoke boiling up from the trees to the north. Breck had done it. The fire was burning. They found the seismograph station just as the smoke column reached its peak. It was a small concrete building, half swallowed by vines and moss. It was derelict, but inside, though dusty, the equipment was surprisingly intact. Old but functional, and the retransmitter tower, though rusted, still stood. They scrambled to activate the equipment. Kohler, with his medic training, had some basic electronics knowledge. Becker, the mechanic, understood circuits. Working together frantically, following faded diagrams, they managed to power up the retransmitter. Hart grabbed the radio handset connected to the system. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Unit 7 survivors. We are under attack. Location grid reference." He rattled off their coordinates from the map, ignoring protocol, ignoring standard call signs. Request immediate extraction. Multiple casualties. This is not an exercise. We are being hunted. Repeat. Requesting immediate extraction. He repeated the call, his voice hoarse, pouring all their desperation into the transmission. Silence. Then a voice. Crisp, professional. "Unit 7 survivors, this is command. Signal received. Extraction confirmed. Stay on frequency. Estimate 45 minutes. Relief so potent it made their knees weak. Flooded through them. 45 minutes. They just had to hold on." They watched the smoke rise, listened to the forest around them, tense with anticipation. The fire had worked. The object was drawn away. The observers were converging on the smoke, not on them. In the distance, through the trees, they caught a fleeting glimpse of movement. Too large, too fast, too low to the ground to be a deer. It was moving away from them, towards the smoke. Breck's sacrifice worked. 45 minutes felt like an eternity. Every shadow was a threat. Every sound sent them rigid with fear. But the minutes ticked by. Finally they heard it. The distant, unmistakable thrum of helicopter blades, getting louder. They ran out of the station, waving frantically as the helicopter appeared through the trees, descending into the clearing. It was a standard military transport helicopter. It settled onto the ground, the downdraft whipping leaves and dust. The ramp lowered. Figures in standard fatigues motioned them forward. Hart, Salazar, Becker, and Kohler ran towards it, stumbling with exhaustion and relief. Salvation. They reached the ramp. The figures blocked their path. "Names?" one of them asked, his face blank, devoid of emotion. "Wagner, Specialist Hart," Hart gasped. "Salazar, First Sergeant. Becker, Sergeant. Kohler, Specialist." The figure looked at a manifest clipped to a clipboard. His eyes scanned the list. He looked up at them, his expression unchanging. "We have only one passenger listed, Specialist Wagner," he said in a flat tone. "The others, they are not on the manifest. It must be a clerical error. There is no space." Hart stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "No. We came out together. They are with me. They are survivors." The figure did not even look at Salazar, Becker, or Kohler. "Specialist Wagner, please board. We have a schedule." Hart protested, shouting, gesturing wildly. But strong hands gripped his arms, propelling him forward. He fought, looking back at his comrades' stunned, horrified faces. "Go, Hart!" Salazar yelled, his voice cracking. "Go! Tell them!" They shoved Hart into the helicopter bay. The ramp began to close. Through the narrowing gap, Hart saw Salazar, Becker, and Kohler standing in the clearing, watching him go, abandoned. Their faces were etched with betrayal and dawning horror. He screamed their names, pounded on the closing ramp, but the noise of the engines drowned him out. The ramp sealed shut. The helicopter lifted off, leaving the three soldiers standing alone in the clearing, miles deep in a forest where an object hunted and a program controlled everything. Hart Wagner was safe, but he was the only one. His rescue was not a rescue of soldiers. It was the recovery of one asset, one anomaly, according to a cold, brutal protocol. The others were simply not on the manifest, disposed of, written off. 3 weeks passed. Hart Wagner was in a sterile, brightly lit room. The questions were relentless but strangely detached. They wanted to know about the incident, about the training exercise, about the unforeseen circumstances. They asked about the deaths, but the questions were procedural, lacking any real empathy or concern for the men themselves. When he explained what he had seen, what he had read in the documents, the impossible nature of the attacks, about the camera and the intercepted message, they nodded politely, made notes, and steered the conversation back to the exercise parameters and his perceptions under stress. They never asked about Salazar, Becker, Kohler, or Breck, or the first corporal. When he brought them up, asking where they were, what had happened to them, they looked away, changed the subject, or simply stated that official records showed only one survivor was recovered from the designated training area. He was informed that the unit's roster showed training losses consistent with the reports. His comrades, the men who had faced down hell with him, were erased. He was diagnosed with acute post-traumatic stress disorder. The doctors were sympathetic, professional. Post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a convenient label. It explained away his delusions, his claims of a program, of an object, of deliberate sacrifice. It neatly categorized his experience as the breakdown of a soldier under pressure, rather than the accurate testimony of a witness to atrocity. He was deemed unfit for duty, his mind too damaged by the trauma to be a reliable witness or a useful soldier. They released him, discharged him quietly with a medical waiver. He walked out of the facility, blinking in the bright autumn sunlight, the air crisp and cool. He was alive, physically unharmed. But inside, he felt hollowed out, scraped clean by the things he had seen and the truth he now carried alone. He looked back once at the building. Through a large window he saw a desk, and on it a simple black folder. His eyes, honed by years of scanning terrain, focused on it. In bold white letters he read the label: Feeding Program, Forest Module, Object, Beta, Efficiency, High, Group Replacement, 60 days. He felt no shock. No surprise. Only a cold, bone-deep confirmation of everything he knew. The program was ongoing. The object had a name: Beta. Their deployment had been rated high efficiency. Enough substrate had been accepted. And in 60 days, another unit, another group of soldiers, would be sent into the woods of the Upper Peninsula, given blanks and a useless map to serve as the next group replacement. The cycle continued, hidden from the world, maintained by the system that consumed its own. Hart Wagner, the lone survivor, walked away, a ghost haunted by truths no one believed. Another silent casualty of a war waged in the shadows against an enemy the world refused to acknowledge. His survival was not a triumph, but merely the closing of a protocol. He knew the truth, but the system ensured he was harmless. He was damaged goods, conveniently labeled, and sent home to be forgotten. The forest kept its secrets, and the program fed on.